we're just going to get started. As I've said, most of you all have done workshops with us before. For those who are new, just a little bit about myself. My name's David. I'm the director of the Narrative Institute. Um, Done workshops on narrative therapy and other related topics now for several years. We started the Narrative Institute in 2011. Have gotten out of the habits of regular workshops in recent years because in into 2015 began the process of starting up a psychiatry practice, and it just that ended up taking up a lot of energy, and but now back into a regular course of doing our workshops again, and it's an enjoyable thing to me, and so I'm happy to kind of get back into it. As we said, throughout the day, we welcome your thoughts and your questions. If you have any, here's again email address narrativeinstitute@gmail.com. And throughout the day, as we're going for the next few hours, we'll take a break about midway. But feel free to, again, it's the nice thing about a webinar. If you need to get up and walk around, or stretch your legs, or get something to eat, or feel free to, and we'll just continue to bounce along. Getting into the day and our particular topic. This is a topic that when I talk to people about it, a main comment I get from people in about this workshop when I tell them about it, and they say, well, man, like I probably need to take that, but I really don't want to because narcissism has kind of become a byword for in a lot of ways just clients, particularly that we find we don't like, which isn't exactly accurate, and I hope that throughout some of the stuff we'll cover today, you'll be able to have a kind of a wider view of kind of what it means and implement and the implications of working with them. One of the things I struggle with as a narrative therapist particularly is even the idea of diagnosis. For a lot of people who've studied narrative therapy and have done kind of a narrative informed practice, it's very much a strengths-based approach, and the idea of focusing on pathology is it's a hard thing, and we do we want to focus on a pathological way of talking about things, and even the concept of talking about narcissism, a lot of it is a holdover from a lot of psychoanalytic conversation, and how early therapists in the 20th century, Freud and his immediate disciples, thought about their stages of development and people who would get stuck in certain phases. Some of the words we use for some personality disorders and stuff we'll cover today are not the most popular. I did a version of this workshop, an early version in it, in I think it was 2009, 2010, and was talking about several different personality disorders in the cluster B group. When we'll talk about some of the other ones today, but I was talking about histrionic personality disorder, and there was a therapist there who she got very offended as I started talking about histrionic, and she said, do you know what histrionic means? And honestly, I didn't know the root of the word, and they were talking about the root of the word, and she said it means wandering uterus, and as I studied it later, actually it does. It had to do with kind of pre-modern medical thinking of how body parts didn't stay in the same place, and there were certain pathologies that would happen if a body part would begin moving around, and the objection is it came from a very kind of sexist approach to looking at pathology and how it affected different genders, and I heard the feedback, and I thought it was relevant, and that the person had a point, but what I came back to them and said is like, well, I didn't come up with the phrase, and it's still what we use in the DSM, and at that point it's DSM-4, but still in the DSM-5 we use the same phrases. As a narrative therapist, though, one of the things I want to stay on is this. I'm going to talk about the sense of a personality style, and very much looking at it's less about labeling people in ways that are unhelpful, but much more about um, a way of understanding a grouping of traits and personality that allows certain aspects of the therapeutic process to be more predictable. That in looking at the presence of certain traits over others, um, that in treatment planning and also just being kind of emotionally prepared for what might happen next in therapy, it gives us some heads up, and that's where I find talking about this is the most helpful. Is I have a concept of certain personality styles. It means that I have options and an awareness of how to formulate treatment and how to move forward and trying different things. Um, um, Hold on one second. Got a question. Got a technical question need to solve real quick. Okay, back into it. So a relevant question is, what is narcissism? And there are lots of different ways. Freud in his early work talked about the idea of kind of an adolescent megalomania, that as someone moved into adulthood, they had not grown out of. And the DSM and its different evolutions has refined some of the things in the diagnosis, but I do think it's a helpful place to look at, in how we conceptualize it. Um, Talk some about, Freud in his thinking was very much of that there's a self-centeredness that happens in children, and that a healthy child kind of progresses and moves past it, and that an unhealthy one continues to maintain those traits as an adult, which is the basis of understanding the personality disorder, lots of different elements of it. Even to this day, we still have the diagnostic criteria of that. Personality disorders, we don't diagnose them in those under 18. To fully qualify, you have to be over 18. Now, a lot of us in our therapeutic work will look at individuals and say, that seems to be a particular personality disorder in the making, and sometimes that is the case. Um, uh, but in hitting the full diagnostic criteria, have to hit over 18. A lot of what we're going to talk about today, and we'll talk about this again, is thinking about personality styles. We'll talk some about the disorders of those that individuals that meet actual diagnostic criteria. But more often than not, um, at least in my clinical work, I come across a lot more people that are, what I've had supervisors and professors of mine in the past talk about. They have this personality style. They may not meet all the diagnostic criteria, but they do. You have enough of it that you get the flavoring. And so even though we are going to talk about narcissistic personality disorder today, a lot of the stuff is going to apply to people that may not meet all the criteria, but meet enough of it that it informs your work. And again, the importance of looking at this is it's a personality styling that has a pervasiveness, um, that touches enough points in their lives that it has a major effect on the people themselves and also their relationships. And again, wanting to take the stuff we talk about today for a very utilitarian approach of how to conceptualize a personality and how to intervene in ways that are going to be most helpful for that person themselves, but also for other people in their lives. But looking at DSM-5 right now and the current diagnostic criteria, from the DSM-5, narcissistic personality disorder, full disorder, is a pervasive pattern of grandiosity in both their behavior and fantasy, having a need for admiration and a lack of empathy for others. And this beginning early in adulthood, and it's pervasive, and it presents itself in a variety of contexts. Somebody might have a lot of conceit or a need for admiration in certain areas of their life. But for them to, when we start talking about, is this person really a narcissist? It's really like, it's lots of areas. It's not just in one. To meet current DSM-5 criteria, at least 5 of the following criteria need to be met. Person has a grandiose sense of self-importance, and I will say, before we go further, it is very easy to look at individual. Self-diagnosis is really difficult, and you know, as I've done more and more work in this, I think of people I interact with clinically and trying to have an objective sense of how they meet a criteria. But as we listen to this, one of the things I want to remind myself and also everyone else is it's very hard to diagnose people we're close to because again, we how this impacts how a person's behavior impacts our lives. And somebody might or treat us in a way that's really problematic, or we might have a relationship that's really difficult. That doesn't necessarily mean the person's a full-on narcissist, at least in a clinical sense. Now, it might be, but it's when I go through these different criteria, I remember as a graduate student sitting down with my copy of the DSM-4 of the time with roommates, kind of going through the criteria, and a lot of people saying like, "Yeah, you really meet this criteria." And again, just as we think about things, think about it in the clinical context and not as much a personal one. But anyway, side note there. Grandiose sense of self-importance. Other is very preoccupied with their fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, idealization in love and relationships. One of the ways that this manifests is that it's a person that's they have a very difficult time seemingly being content with things. They might experience a certain success in their job and a personal relationship, and even though they kind of glory in that in the moment, it's also very clear that they're very quick to kind of, and it will be even better. I made this much money in sales in my job this year. I'll be able to double it next year, triple it, and the level of expansiveness just kind of keeps going without any sort of sense of what limits there might be. Very much focuses on how they see themselves as special and unique. A lot of it has to do with how they explain their difficulty in dealing with individuals or institutions, or you don't understand because I'm very special in some sort of way, whether I'm very brilliant or I'm very intuitive, or something about myself sets me apart. It's a way to justify sometimes their inability to function well in certain situations. It also has to do with how they demand certain accommodations at times for themselves. They require excessive admiration. It's not just that they want to be liked. They want to be told and shown on a very frequent and excessive basis of that they are wonderful, that they are special, that they are all the things that they seemingly are grasping for. They very much have a sense of entitlement. They expect to be treated in special ways. Another way to think of it, they often talk about in certain rules and justifications of why rules or limitations shouldn't apply to them. They may see a standard or a rule in an organization, a school, a company as being generally a good rule or a good idea for everyone else, but particularly as it suits them and in their situations, they really don't necessarily see why it should have to apply to them. They can be very interpersonally explosive and exploitative. The way they objectify people or seemingly objectify people is quite easy to them. Again, related to their sense of entitlement, their sense of specialness. They don't necessarily have a lot of scruples in taking advantage of situations or others if they think it justifies the ends of what they're trying to reach. Um, they lack empathy, though we will get into later today of this isn't universal. Um, there's certain recent studies that will look at different sorts of empathy. But they, in a broader sense, though, they do lack empathy and is unwilling to recognize the needs or feelings of others as they go about their desires or achieving the goals in their lives. And they're very obviously envious of others, or will constantly talk about that others are envious of themselves, um, or that other people are envious of the person experiencing these symptoms. And lastly, shows arrogant and very haughty behaviors or attitudes, um, which is one of the more off-putting points of the personality style. But for the stuff we looked at before, the different 9 symptoms, current DSM-5 criteria is that for a person to meet full-on diagnosis narcissistic personality disorder, they need to meet at least 5 of those. But there might be, patients you work with, people that you can think of right now in your current caseload and in the past, that as you think through those different points, you think, well, they're really solid 3 of them, or 4, maybe not fully 5. Um, uh, Lynn Sperry is somebody who's written a lot on the area of personality disorders, and he's one that's really pushed this idea of a spectrum, that you have a much smaller percentage of people that meet full-on criteria. Current research shows that it's different in different community samples. The highest community sample rate that you'll usually get for people that meet narcissistic personality disorder is around 6.2% of people in any given sample. But there are many more individuals that will meet certain aspects of the spectrum. And again, thinking about it in a spectrum sense, I think gives some flexibility in conceptualizing your cases. Um, but again, the part of it that I see as valuable is if you are able to anticipate certain reactions or behaviors because of aspects of the personality that are presenting themselves, then it makes treatment planning and also just managing the give and take, the flow of therapy, a lot easier. But looking at more aspects of it, this is, generally how does this present in a therapeutic standpoint. In the context of counseling, or strong narcissistic style present to therapy for reasons that they'll easily identify as faults with themselves. Very often, it's external forces that drive them into to seek therapy, or to be sometimes mandated therapy. Sometimes it's conflict with their spouse, or issues that they're having parenting wise. It might be conflicts with work, or in their context of their faith environment. Sometimes it's legal things that come up. Oftentimes that there's maybe not necessarily a mandating in a legal sense for these individuals to come to counseling, though sometimes that happens. But it's very much an external issue that they'll identify. They'll not necessarily see themselves very easily as the real problem. They'll see, it being something else. That the problem that's bringing me here is because this is what's going on with my husband, or this is what's going on with my kids, and they might give at times some very shallow recognition of their own part in it. If it's a couple's context, they'll maybe say something, well, we don't communicate well. But when you press into it, it seems to be much more clear that what they mean by that is the other person doesn't respond in the way that they think they need to, and it's hard for them to conceptualize their own faults in it, or at least in a way that seems obvious to the people working with them. And there are elements to this that we'll get into, kind of the reasons why. Um, um, there has been research in looking at how family of origin shapes kind of the creation of narcissistic styles. There is no consensus of absolutely this is where narcissists come from. Um, like so many things we deal with in therapy, there's the different discussions back and forth of, is this is it a nature or nurture thing? Is it determined by biology or genetics, or does environment have the bigger effect? And like a lot of things we see in different therapy-based issues, there seems to be some evidence for both. There does seem to be some genetic factors that lend themselves to these personality styles. In that um, that heredity does seem to have, in one particular study that's in your bibliography, heredity does seem to show at least moderate effects in people developing not just this but other personality disorders. Um, there's been more research done on environmental sort of factors, and particularly in parenting. Um, the most common things that kind of come up is um, it's this idea that the budding narcissist is somebody who, as a child, is oftentimes very overindulged and overpraised, but the attention they receive often is very shallow, and that healthier affirmation is not really there. And how this plays out is somebody who's very much affirmed for performance, somebody who's a star soccer player, a baseball player, or an academic that always is the top of their class or makes these good grades, and they receive a lot of praise from their family, but it's done in a way that emphasizes that you are valued and you are worthy because you perform in this way, and that if you were not performing in this way, that you are not valued and you will not be affirmed. So it's highly conditional, and in both overt messages in families and sometimes even subtle messages, this is communicated and reaffirmed. um, the other aspect too is oftentimes the affirmation is done in more superficial ways, that a parent who will reward a child with money or other material things, which is not in itself a negative reward, but is very problematic when that is done to the detriment of deeper engagement. Um, and so there isn't, again, it's kind of a larger conceptualization is that the narcissistic styled individual is very early trained that they are what they do, and their relationships with people are very transactional. I got a good grade, therefore I get this much money, or I get to go to Disney World, or so. And so even very intimate relationships are seen as very transactional. Um, one of the ways this manifests in the particular vulnerability that narcissists have is narcissists oftentimes come across as very confident and very sure of themselves, overly so. But most of the research has kind of shown that there's a very deep sense of vulnerability, that the grandiosity and the over boastfulness and the arrogance is masking over. And when you kind of dig into it, one of the things that seems to be a major factor is, they talk so much about their successes. They talk so much of, if they're in sales, that they sold to this many people. If they talk about how many people like them or how many people respect them or really seek out their opinions and all these things. And they'll spend so much time talking about that because they don't, if these things weren't true, if these things weren't happening, if people weren't seeking out their opinions, or if people weren't praising them constantly, then they don't have any sense of themselves. It's not just even the sense of the value of themselves. They don't have a sense of how to um, uh, um, they don't know who they are independent of what they're doing. It's some of why these people will often be so overly identified in their careers, because if they weren't, a physician, or they weren't a pastor, or they weren't a professor, or an executive, or whatever it is their role is, then they don't know, they have nothing in themselves that they feel they can hold back on. Good question here came up is in that in looking at affirmation, what is an idea of healthy affirmation? Um, the best that um, the current research on all personality disorders shows, it relates very much to things like Maslow's unconditional positive regard for individuals. But um, I guess what that looks like in action is in a parenting style. How does, as a parent, how do you communicate to the child their value, independent of what they are doing? And so it doesn't negate the importance of encouraging or praising positive actions, but it's how is that done? How is that balanced out with even failure or lack of success, and how do you communicate that with them? And I think of some examples in just some of my clinical work. One person I worked with was a star athlete, and parents were divorced, and um, dad was kind of very infrequent in coming to his games when he was young until he began really performing as kind of the star athlete on his team. And then dad was there at every game. And sports was a major point of connection between this person and his father. And again, that connection wasn't bad, but what the message was very early that dad's coming because I'm winning, not because I'm his son, not because he wants to come see me play, win or lose. It's because I'm winning. And that was even reinforced later because when uh, something had happened where he had some poor games, and very immediately dad quit coming to games. And it wasn't till he became like, "Hey, dad, I scored this many points, or I scored this many goals." And the and even kind of the word of money, and where you know in doing a reward system, like, is money a bad thing? The question is, well, it depends. But if you think back of your own childhood and you think of stories you've heard from people you've worked with of what matters to kids growing up, there oftentimes is a context of different levels of means that families have and how they show affection. But the focal point of what people talk about is oftentimes something that the means of what they're doing is very secondary. I remember in my own story kind of an experience of going jet skiing with my family as a kid for the first time, and that was a lot of fun because going on a jet ski was really cool. But when I think about that day, what matters to me more was like time with my family, time with my brothers and my dad. And the jet ski was nice, but it was very secondary to what we were doing. And you talk about families that they'll go on a ski trip, or they'll go to Disney World, or they'll get a car, but a lot of it really is when they tell those stories, and what matters to them about that is very much secondary to the relational aspect. But when for a narcissistic family, it oftentimes the focus is overly put on the material thing. So hopefully that gives some ideas. Again, it's not necessarily the the structure by itself of what's happening or not happening, but what is the attitude that's communicated in it and in that context. But good question. um, Defense mechanisms. I want to highlight this here because this may or may not end up being a question on the post test. um, when a narcissist feels threatened, these are the things they do. First thing is they idealize, and they don't have to be actively threatened um, to use this, but a lot of how they end up talking about their lives is a very one-sided. um, uh, how they talk about people, how they talk about institutions, how they talk about relationships, really fall into first the idealization point, and then very quickly after that the devaluation. And they're really two sides of the same coin. But they will talk about a person is all bad, or an object or an institution is all bad, or it is all good. And oftentimes it's something that at one point was all good will become all bad, and there's no nuance in it. One of the aspects that gets on my radar, that makes my antenna come up pretty quickly when I'm seeing somebody, is in a therapeutic context. Do I get does the person communicate to me an over idealized version of me? Um, when I think of some of my early interactions with people with this personality style, this was one of the things that really sucked me um, in ways that were really unhelpful. The first or second session, they begin talking about, like, you understand me in a way that no one else does, or I've been to all these other therapists and they were all horrible, but you're so good and you're so brilliant. You're so, if I hear that now, I immediately become guarded in a certain way, and not necessarily in a way that I'm trying to push them away, but I try to become aware, because I haven't necessarily done anything yet to warrant this level of praise. And what it communicates to me is that if this person really does have this defense mechanism style, I will at some point fall out of their good graces and then become devalued. And if I've bought into too much this idea that I'm a wonderful therapist and I do such great work, that as soon as I step out of line in their view, then you're horrible, and you don't know what you're talking about, and I can't believe that you're licensed, or any of these things. Related to both the style of idealization and devaluation is denial. um, they will be very insistent on a point of view that's very, both grandiose of themselves and their intentions, their actions, their achievements, and it will seem very impervious to evidence that shows otherwise. Again, this can be very frustrating, but this comes from an ultimate place of vulnerability, because they don't have any sense of value of themselves, any way of conceptualizing themselves independent of what I did, or uh, uh, who values me or my accomplishments. um, if that seems to crumble, then because it's almost like they're standing on the edge of this endless abyss, they will hold on to this idea and try to sell you on it in a way that's so convincing, because they don't feel they have anything else to fall back on. They can't admit that they were wrong very easily, because to admit that they were wrong means stepping over the edge into that abyss, because there's no ledge for them to fall on. They didn't, if you look back on the parenting styles, they had a sense that if I'm not performing at this level, if I'm not doing everything that I said I was going to do, or I said that I have done, then there's no grace. There's no, hey buddy, sorry you lost the game today, but still love you. You had a good hustle. None of that was communicated to them, and so they have that in so many other places in their life. Um, when you meet these individuals, oftentimes they are very charming. Successful narcissists, in that the people that have been able to get on in their life in a lot of different contexts without their narcissism creating too much havoc. Oftentimes, how they are able to get over that hump is um, they're very charismatic, and they come across as very powerful. And oftentimes, they will talk to you in ways that will reinforce the sense that they have very deep loyalty. They'll talk about other people um, that are in their life as people that they have very intense loyalty to. Because they spend so much time talking about their achievements, and because they are often very convincing, you will very often hear this person talk about what they've done. In work context, they'll talk about, well, I did this in my last job, and this and this, and they're so charming and so charismatic in it, you believe everything. And it's like, wow, this person really is wonderful. They really are kind of all these things. And again, they didn't necessarily manage in life this long with these liabilities without They couldn't have done it unless they had this level of charm or charisma. Um, the the way though that worm can turn very quickly is a lot of the literature about narcissism will talk about someone being in a narcissist orbit, like a planet, and that as long as you're in their narcissistic orbit, you are good. In this whole idealization that everything you do is good, all your intentions are good. Um, I'll be loyal to you. I'll be all these things, and that's as soon as you're that's as long as you are fitting into um, this paradigm that suits the narcissistic leaning person. But as soon as you fall out of that orbit, um, one of the things that can feel so wounding and it can happen so quickly, as soon as you fall out of that orbit, how quickly the narcissistic styled person can turn, quickly fall into that devaluation place, and all loyalty, all charm, all that quickly disappears. Um, the um, in a therapeutic context, one of the things that makes this really difficult is, you know, you can easily find that you think you have this really deep and meaningful therapeutic rapport with somebody beginning in the relationship. But as soon as you step out of what they expect, as soon as you push on them in a way that you don't, that they don't want or they see as challenging to their sense of themselves, um, how vicious it can become at times. In looking at a narrative context, this pulls from a lot of. I'm very interested in the archetypal work started with Carl Jung, and in that perspective of therapy and how that relates to sense of story. But one way that I think it's good to think about like kind of the archetype of the narcissist is they very much see themselves as the archetypal hero. In a story, the hero is good, and it's part of that person, you know, his or her nature. And an action becomes a good action because the hero does it, not because it's a good, that the hero does good things. It's that the hero is, and therefore everything the hero does is wonderful and should be admired. The how this will relate and how they talk about themselves, their actions, their achievements is very much of, the deep-seated narcissist will typically talk about themselves in two ways. The traditional hero, who succeeds and conquers and everyone thinks is wonderful, or the persecuted tragic hero, that if a situation has gone bad, it's because of the villainy of others, because other people were taking advantage of them, other people were not doing the right thing. But they have no flexibility, or they have very limited flexibility to see themselves outside of this role. They're either the traditional hero or the victim, but nothing in between. And one of the ways that it's easy, I guess, to kind of hear this, or is when you listen to someone's story, is they will talk about all the different players in their story, their family members, their coworkers, their spouse, their children, as either being other heroes or villains. It's almost like when you're listening to a very heavily leaning narcissistic individual, that there's no nuance in the characters of their life. That there are good guys and there are bad guys, and there's nothing in between. And their sense of being a hero too is, it goes back to the idea we were talking about before, that they don't have a concept of themselves discernible from their actions or their achievements. They are what they have done, or they are what people see them doing. And a hero is not valuable unless he's out doing, or she's out doing heroic things. It's why oftentimes they will really work hard to maintain a fiction of their achievements, even when they haven't accomplished nearly as much, because they don't. If they weren't everything they said they were, then they couldn't be the hero. and that's just unacceptable. It's not even just like I feel like I want to be the hero. I don't even know how to think about things outside of me being the hero. And again, at any point, as y'all have questions or any thoughts, feel free to email them in. We'll take a look at them. A side note, want to talk about gender, and particularly as it plays into narcissism. Both men and women, fall into the narcissistic style, but it is diagnosed in uneven ways. And this also might be on the post test, so I would draw attention to this question. And for those individuals that are diagnosed, only about 25% of individuals diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder are women, and therefore the other 75% are more heavily diagnosed as men. A lot of the current studies in looking at what are specific stylistic traits of narcissism in women that may set them apart from typical narcissistic styles in men, a lot of the studies have focused on traits of willfulness and conflict-driven autonomy. That in they push in independent courses in ways that don't seem as gender typical, and so it's oftentimes commented on differently for women than it would be for men. Whether or not this is a helpful paradigm to think about the gender differences in narcissism, I feel on the fence about. It's just more of this is where current studies have kind of shown. There are some theorists, specifically a person I studied a lot of in graduate school, Nancy McWilliams, who has written a lot on psychoanalytic approaches to therapy, who talks about the different personality disorders in the cluster B group as being sort of gender divided. And they've talked about the idea of that a more feminized version of narcissism is borderline personality disorder, and not that it excludes men from meeting the criteria for borderline personality disorder or women from meeting the criteria of narcissism, but of just how it tends to manifest along gender lines, that you'll see more of one or the other, and that even though there are defining differences between the two, that they have more commonalities than they do differences. Related to that, it is for differential purposes, it is, I think, helpful to look at what are the other personality disorders in the cluster B group, and how to distinguish them between narcissistic personality disorder, and starting first with borderline personality disorder. From DSM-5, it's a pattern of instability in interpersonal relationships, affecting their self-image, their affect, and there's a strong element of impulsivity related there. A big differential point between this and narcissism is their sense of self-image. The narcissist may have a very skewed sense of themselves and the image of themselves, but oftentimes it's not quite as labile. They tend to be very consistent in how they see themselves, even if it is inconsistent with reality. It's consistent internally for themselves. Whereas classic borderline traits tend to show a lot more of an instability in the self-image, and also the impulsivity is typically much stronger in the borderline styles, as well as a specific fear of abandonment. Narcissistic styles will be very focused on their need for admiration, but it's less about, for the borderline style, it's more about, I'm afraid you're going to disengage from me. Where the narcissistic concern is, I'm concerned that you do not see me as awesome as I think you need to see me. Other sort, antisocial. This, like narcissistic personality disorder, is more readily diagnosed in men than women. From DSM-5, it's represented in a pattern of disregard and violation of the rights of others. In differentiating this between narcissism, like the differential between narcissism and borderline styles, Narcissism typically doesn't have as much impulsivity or aggression, and sometimes, though not always, the same level of deceit. A narcissistic person's deceit oftentimes will play much more in the context of their denial or their self-aggrandizement, whereas an antisocial type will be more quick to use deceit in a much more general sense for lots of different means. Um, Also, the antisocial type typically has a lot less need for admiration than the narcissistic individual does. And going back to the archetypal idea, if the narcissist is the hero archetype, the antisocial personality is an anti-hero person. They're they're not concerned with being good. They're concerned with being powerful. Um, that they are seen as altruistic and righteous in their endeavors is not important necessarily to the antisocial type. The same way it's not important to the anti-hero type. It's very much that they're in control of the situation, and that people see them as powerful, not necessarily as important to see them as good. I do think and this is an important aspect of it too. At least for men, about 25% of men who meet the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder also meet the criteria for antisocial personality disorder, and vice versa. Um, there are a few individuals I have known, some I'm not thinking in a clinical standpoint, but otherwise, that I feel were just as antisocial as they were narcissistic. And sometimes it was contextually driven, but it was somebody. I think of individuals who have a very deep and driving need to be admired, but they're very ruthless in how they do it in ways that show a higher disregard for the rights of others, more so than it's not just lack of empathy. They're oftentimes actively transgressional in how they seek to accomplish their ends. Um, and so, in looking at these things too, a person may meet diagnostic criteria for one and also meet diagnostic criteria for the other. Lastly, histrionic style. Um, as I was doing some reading on histrionic style and in preparation for this, um, I came across this one article that in trying to typify the histrionic style. And for those of you who are familiar with the American version of the TV show The Office, there was a whole article about the character Kelly Kapoor, who's played by the actress and writer Mindy Kaling, and classic histrionic style. There's actually an episode of the TV show The Office where they're writing on a whiteboard their goals for the year, and under Kelly's goals, it says to get more attention by any means necessary, and that is the classic histrionic style. It's represented by a pattern of excessive emotionality and attention seeking, and as differential between the narcissists, they're oftentimes less concerned with whether the attention is admiring or not. They just want attention. And so oftentimes they'll take even negative attention, scornful attention. It's still attention. People are looking at me. Where the narcissist very much cares what sort of attention they're getting. They want to be admired and praised. Other ways, though, that are make it easier to differentiate. The histrionic style is a lot less concerned with showing excessive pride or bragging about their achievements. They are not as disdainful for other people's emotions. They're typically more emotionally expressive themselves compared to the typical narcissist. They will come across as more emotionally sensitive. It will oftentimes be in very shallow ways, whereas the emotional sensitivity for the narcissist will oftentimes just be completely lacking. One question was asking for a bit more elaboration with the gender differences in the personality disorders, which it is fascinating, and it kind of even goes to the idea of how we even talk about gender, because there is this idea of how much of our sense of gender is a social construct. We were raised a certain way, and that's how how much of it is innate. And that's been a major area of study within the mental health field for a while, and continues to be. In the cluster B style of personality disorders, there are 4 personality disorders in the cluster B, and there is major gender divides in how they're diagnosed and how they're even kind of socially considered. Both borderline personality disorder and histrionic personality disorder are diagnosed far more frequently in women, and uh, narcissistic and antisocial personality disorders diagnosed far more frequently in men. Um, One study, as I was preparing for this incarnation of the workshop, that I found interesting was even looking at how the different personality disorders change over time. That both narcissism and histrionic personality disorders tend to be fairly constant over a lifespan in their level of severity. But both antisocial and borderline personality disorders tend to lessen in their severity with age. That's not 100% of individuals, and um, that study is included in the bibliography for this presentation. There wasn't much of a conclusion as to why, but one idea is this idea of that narcissistic style and borderline styles are related to each other, and antisocial and histrionic are related to each other. And might there be in the cluster B a way to consider that there aren't 4 personality disorders, but 2 personality disorders that manifest along the continuum, and so there are different aspects in it. The in Another question, and it's somewhat related, is going back and talking about what are some of the hallmarks in beyond just looking through the diagnostic criteria. What are some signs that help the diagnosis process when sitting in a room with somebody. Um, Not to oversimplify, but there are certain phrases that I do talk about as coming up that tend to be hallmarks for certain personality styles, in the very least. For a classic borderline style, one of my favorite examples is the phrase, which many of us have heard in one way, shape, or form. But the phrase is when a client's talking to you and they say something like, "Everyone says I'm crazy, but I know I'm not crazy." Here's why I find that phrase diagnostic. Most of the time, I think of myself as a fairly sane person. But if I am in an environment where I'm getting feedback, where people are questioning, whether my level of mental stability, I would start to naturally question my how mentally stable I was. Even if I felt like I was fairly stable, if everyone's giving me the feedback that I'm not, I would at least start to wonder a little bit. But it's the fact that the person's making the statement, I'm getting all this feedback, but in spite of the feedback, I'm convinced it is untrue. Feels like a very capricious, highly variable, fluctuating way of seeing oneself, which again tends to be a hallmark in that borderline style. For the narcissistic style, a more common phrase I'll see in therapy is I'm working with somebody, and very quickly they will describe an alliance with me that kind of surprises me. They'll say something like, you know, people like you and me, we understand this. Where these other, they may be talking about politics, or they may be talking about some social concept, um, but they will rope me in some statement about their own superiority, which is part of their idealization phase, or it can be that they've included me with the specialness that they have, and they've also talked about it in a way that's exclusive to other people, that we understand the special thing and other people don't. um, that's kind of one example, I guess, of how that kind of comes up, or kind of is a hallmark in therapy. um, you know it's not the same thing for every person, but talking specifically, I guess, about the narcissistic style, one of the things, I guess, the biggest thing I look for is, am I hearing a lot of conversation in caricatures? Am I hearing a lot of caricatures of people, both in the room and outside of the room, and how this individual is talking about themselves and other people? Am I hearing nuance about their parents, about their childhood, about their spouse, about their coworkers, or or am I hearing a lot of pictures of black and white, of the wonderfulness of certain individuals, or the uh, majorly flawed aspects of other individuals with not a lot in between? Um, Again, those tend to be some of the factors I look at. But good questions, and thank y'all for it. In looking at some considerations, do want to look at a very quick overview of narrative therapy. For those who have done any of my courses before, this will be familiar, but for those who haven't, or who are not as familiar with narrative therapy, some basic philosophical structures I do think is important. The two basic philosophical understandings that underpin narrative therapy is post-structuralism and existentialism. And these will not be questions on the post-test, but it is kind of important to know and kind of an understanding. Post-structuralism, it's a philosophical approach which sees experience um, as being very much of how our knowledge of something is very much through the structure of how we experience it. And that sounds very complex, and so I'll try to give an example of it. I imagine most people here are sitting down, and so you're sitting on something. You're sitting on a bench or a chair or something, and you feel, that chair underneath you. You can touch it. You feel the pressure points of it against your body, um, and that is how you interpret the structure, the chair. But how you interpret it is very much linked to your physical senses, your nerve endings, how your brain is processing the data that's coming in. And a post-structural view is saying that you cannot talk about the chair independent of talking about how you interpret the chair through your senses and other things. It's the same way that if you were to wear glasses that had a bluish tint or a rose color tint, that would affect how you saw everything. So your perspective is essential in your interpretation of the thing. And you cannot talk about the thing independent of that interpretation, because if your brain was structured differently than what it is, if your nerve endings or how your body communicated information to your brain was structured differently than how it is, it would affect how you would talk about the chair or whatever it is. From a therapeutic perspective, where this is important is perspective matters, and how you interpret the other person matters. What we call even the sense of personality disorders, or what are helpful or unhelpful ways of doing things, is very much contextualized within the setting that we exist. Um, we live in everyone who's attending this workshop is in the United States, I think. And part of living in a first world context, there's certain social styles, or certain social interactions driven by our personality styles that are more highly valued and seen as more pro-social than others. If we functioned in a hunter-gatherer society, certain personality structures would be seen as better than others. If we were living in a Walking Dead, post-apocalyptic zombie netherworld, what we would see as valuable traits in leadership would be seen differently than in other contexts. And when I'm seeing a person that I'm interpreting as a narcissistic individual, there's something about their personality structure, even though it's causing them problems, whether they're recognizing the ways it's causing them problems or not. There's something about their personality structure that has been helpful to them, that's been functional to them, and that fits in how they interpret the world. I don't believe it's as helpful as it can be, and obviously, I believe that there are problems in how they interpret things, but it fits, at least on some level, it fits for them. And being able to see that in a nuanced way that allows some layers is usually helpful for them in this. First aspect is the post-structuralism. The other aspect very much related to it is existentialism, which is this idea that knowledge, the basis of all knowledge, comes from personal experience. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that all knowledge is based on my personal experience, but of how we collect and transmit knowledge as humans comes from experiences of somebody. That even if I'm reading a research paper, I am getting the experience of the writer, or the person who's presenting the research paper. They're relating the experiences of their test subjects or a sample of people, or that beginning of all knowledge kind of comes from experiencing something. And this kind of relates to that. I believe that any personality disordered individual, but specifically the narcissistic styled person, is they're seeing their world through a keyhole. That there's aspects of how they're experiencing their world that is very narrowed, and it kind of goes to the black and white, good or evil, hero villain sort of thing. They have a very narrow scope of how they're seeing and interpreting things. And so part of my approach is not necessarily to change what they see, but how do I take it from a keyhole to maybe a wider hole or a window or maybe even a door. It kind of going from a very narrow range of perception and interpretation to a wider one. There are lots of benefits to this, and we'll get into that here quickly. But as we talk about different ways to apply, I'm going to get into some vignettes. We're going to talk about two different sorts of clients right now, and then we'll talk about them first and their situations, and then we'll talk about how the different techniques and conceptualizations could apply to them in their situation. First person we're going to talk about is Clint. Clint is a high-level business executive who, according to him specifically, has been very successful in everything that he has done. He is coming into therapy with his wife, who's showing signs of depression. As you kind of get into their story, he found you because he did all this research and he talked to people, and he's very quick to tell you as he comes in, like, I heard you were the best, and and we really much needed. We didn't need to waste time with these other people. We really wanted to see the best person, and very quickly you get an idealization experience with this person as they come in, talking about how we haven't met yet, but I know how great you are. I've read your online reviews. You had a lot of 5-star reviews on Yelp. And I've talked to this person maybe who saw you before, and they're great, and you did great work with them and all this. As you get in their story, they are recent empty nesters, Clint and his wife. Their youngest child has just gone away to college, and Clint's wife, who worked as a full-time homemaker, she describes herself as feeling kind of aimless. That she doesn't have a lot of energy. She doesn't really know how to spend her time. She was very involved in the job of raising their children, which was a value that Clint had as well, to have his wife be full-time working in the home. But now, they not running to volleyball practice or soccer practice anymore, don't have the same activities that were built around their children. It's just them in the house, and she's describing just feeling very aimless. And she talks about feeling very deflated, and she doesn't really know what her purpose is at this point, and is generally just feeling very low and sad and unmotivated. And this is really frustrating Clint, because Clint wants to travel. He's constantly, in fact, he's in your office right now on his smartphone talking about, because he's been reading about travel hacking, and he's looking at all these things he wants to do, and he just doesn't understand why his wife just can't snap out of this. He's coming into therapy with her, but he very much sees it as therapy for her. He just wants to make sure that all these things, because his goal is to make sure that his wife is fixed, and then that they can, get past this and go and do the things that are important to him. I'm sure that everyone is just feeling this overwhelming sympathy towards Clint in this moment, but um, so he's one sort of client that we'll talk about and how this applies, but we'll do another. This is Amber. Um, Amber's story is a little different. She's a recent graduate from college. She comes into the first session with her parents, who are paying for the sessions. And but the reason her parents are coming in is they said it's very important for you to get the quote full story. Now, the backstory is that she was recently fired from a job after being caught plagiarizing. She went to work for an online publication. She did a major in journalism. She graduated, got this job, and uh, and for the longest time, what she told her parents was, the job's going great. This is an amazing company, and they love me so much here. This is, uh, basically they're so lucky to have me. And then she gets fired, and her parents, they had some friends that were involved in working for the same company, and they kind of got a version of the story that was different, because when they asked Amber, she's just like, well, she very much minimized the reasons and very quickly disparaged the company, basically, that it's a rag. They do horrible work there. I'm much better off going to do something different. But as her parents are telling you that kind of more of the full story as they came to understand it was, that she was caught plagiarizing, which is then what led her to be fired. But she was actually on probation before then because she had a very hard time meeting deadlines. She was often late to work. And when her parents, confronted her about some of these things, she was very dismissive about, like, no, I was never late. That's not true. And very much kind of minimizes the whole process. Um, Her parents have made coming to therapy uh, a condition of them to financially help her as she's out of a job right now. They're willing to help her, but they've said, you've got to go talk to somebody because this is something you've got to deal with. So you have the first session, you kind of take this information. Amber comes across as fairly hostile to the whole idea of therapy at the beginning, but by the next session, when you're just meeting with her, um, you find her as quite charming. And she very quickly, you can see her charisma. And as she kind of tells her backstory of what she did, what high school was like for her, and what college was, she kind of paints this picture of, this person that basically quote had it all. That a lot of her stories have to do with basically how admired she was. She worked for the school newspaper and how great her work was, and she won these prizes. And you know, you do some research on her kind of after, in between sessions, and like a lot of this stuff seems to be true-ish. There isn't a whole lot that you find that's completely untrue, but it's very kind of painted in this overly glowing terms about how just awesome she is. Um, and so you struggle with her because, as Amber continues to talk about um, the situations that brought her to counseling, you very much feel this picture of this very talented, exceptional person that has been persecuted and misunderstood, which brought her into this situation that her parents don't really understand her, that her employer didn't really understand her, and she has all this great work and all this great talent, and she's just being really, really neglected and taken advantage of in these situations. And even though you got the initial information from her parents, the more time you spend with her, the more you're inclined to discount that and to believe the version as it's being presented by Amber. Um, getting into the therapeutic process, looking at these two individuals. Certain things to highlight in research that has been done on narcissists that does affect kind of the general flow of therapy. This may not seem that difficult to understand, but uh, it's been shown that for narcissistic personality styled individuals, that they are inclined to see the therapist as less competent and to see therapy as less effective when they are receiving negative feedback. When they are receiving positive feedback, the inverse is true. They see the therapist as very competent and they see therapy as very helpful. Um, the intersection for this in a narrative therapy approach, and this relates to the philosophical things we talked about in a few slides ago, is this individual is seeing the world in a certain way, and they have a very limited scope in how much they can take in information. My job as the therapist is not to necessarily alter how they are seeing things, but to expand it. And this kind of goes to one of the fundamental techniques in narrative therapy, thickening, which we're going to cover here in a second. But I don't have to approach them in a way that is adversarial. Therapy can be very much approach of a yes and as opposed to an or but. Because there's a certain sense of how they're telling their story is valid simply because it's how they're telling it. It's representative, at least in some way, of their experience of reality. It may not be an experience of reality consistent with the experience of reality for the people in intimate relationships with them or people close to them, but at the very least, it's consistent with their experience. And you can validate that without agreeing wholesale with all the implications of it. So you can walk along with them in this way that doesn't involve this active pushing against their perspective, but that does allow it to kind of be drawn out and stretched. The other thing that is a helpful point that's highlighted in the current research is one of the aspects that we talked about of narcissism is that these individuals show an impaired empathy. But one of the studies that we have included in the bibliography shows that this is a qualified statement, that their impairment is very high in what we can term emotional empathy, the ability to track and to understand and respond to other people's feelings or emotions. Their cognitive empathy, though, is oftentimes fairly intact and sometimes even enhanced. And what we mean by cognitive empathy is they can more easily understand the thought process of individuals than their emotional process. And so you can oftentimes take a much more analytic or rational approach with them and carry them along to be able to see a perspective as opposed to a more emotional one. These are individuals that are not necessarily going to be as responsive to a much more emotional understanding based therapeutic approach. Kind of a classic person-centered approach, sort of thing. Like they're not going to be, if you're working with a narcissist as part of a couple, they're not going to be able to turn to their spouse and in any sort of authentic way very easily talk about, like, I know how you feel. But they might be able to step along and be able to respond in, like, I think I understand how you're thinking. And being able to kind of take that opening is a path that can really move therapy forward. Covering some things we've talked about before, one of the things I find just great about narrative therapy is I don't have to invalidate what they're presenting. My job, I oftentimes think about the context of I'm an editor to their story. I'm not a creator of their story. I'm helping to process it with them. and I'm taking the raw information that they're bringing and bringing certain aspects of that forward or down, or uh, with doing a consultation earlier this week with somebody talking about the metaphor of a mixing board. That there's this idea of the client specifically is very interested in music, and so talked about the idea that you don't have to ignore what's being heard, but you can, like a mixing board for music, you can bring different levels up. Okay, you can turn the guitar up and vocals down, or the vocals up, guitar down, or add these effects to it, and so it's about processing the information as opposed to invalidating it. And since the narcissistic individual is so hypersensitive to anything that comes anywhere close to disagreement as being inherently invalidating, being able to use a therapeutic approach that doesn't require a lot, if any, disagreement can be very helpful for these individuals, because you're not going to trigger them as quickly. Um, a narrative therapy approach is very much focused on the client is an expert. They're the ones that know their own story better than anybody else. You're there to help them process it, but they're still the expert. And um, since the narcissistic individual has so much defensiveness about um, feeling validated, feeling praised, um, again, since you put them in the driver's seat, they're not going to fight you quite as much. And so in the same way that a therapeutic approach that is overly emotive, they'll push against. A therapeutic approach that is overly therapist driven, at least in the sense of control, they will also be very resistant about, because they're so hypersensitive to, in the sense of giving up control. But if, and using this therapeutic approach that's very overt in saying, well, you're the expert, you know this better than me, in the sense of you know yourself better than I know you, um, it's going to trigger the resistance again a lot less readily. Um, Looking at some techniques, though, getting into the meat of it, and we're going to look at these as they apply to Clint and Amber. I will say, if there's anyone in this presentation that is either named Clint or Amber, or has a significant other that is, my apologies. I struggle with coming up with names because I want to make sure that it's not anyone I know, or if it's anyone who I know who's doing the presentation. Not that there's anything wrong with those names. It's just, it's hard when you're talking about narcissists. You're like, okay, who do I name? What do I give? What name do I give the narcissist? Um, First, the techniques we're going to go through, and these are very classic narrative therapy techniques. The first is a thickening process, and we'll explain what that means. Externalization, unique outcomes, and therapeutic audiencing. And we'll go through just examples of how each of these can apply to each of these cases or these situations. Thickening a thin story. So again, looking at a basic process for narrative therapy. It's less about that what a client is talking about is untrue. Because even if you just take that what they're talking about is true from their perspective, it's true at least in some degree. But in traditional narrative therapy, what we talk about is not that something is untrue, but that it is thin, in that it is a very simplistic, undetailed, unnuanced way of talking about something that does not open itself up naturally to any natural possibilities. An example of a thin story, would be in Clint's situation. He just talked about, well, my wife's being stubborn. She knows she needs to get over this, and this is okay. At least from the aspect of Clint's experience, that is true. The problem with it isn't that it's untrue; it is that it's unhelpful, and that it is not detailed. Because, okay, if the answer is simply, okay, this person is being stubborn, and unless you have a lever to make this person all of a sudden unstubborn, then you're kind of stuck. You're kind of left with the situation as as it is, and there aren't a lot of possibilities. And so instead of disagreement, the process is then looking at uh, thickening. Thickening is like you would a stew or a soup or a sauce. It's adding depth to it. How do you add more? And again, it goes to the whole yes and as opposed to an or but. Um, in Clint's situation, one of the things you might be able to say to this is he's fixated on his wife just needs to get over it. You need to get over being sad, and you push into the some. You talk to him, and part of what you get is you realize there's you know you don't have to come up with more detail. Clients will naturally present more detail if you let them flesh out their story. You can do this by asking questions. For Clint's story, it might be asking, so tell me about what it was like with your kids growing up. How talk about your family's history. How long have you all been together? What was it like when you first got married? What did you enjoy about you know when you first got married? What did you enjoy about parenting? What were the things that were harder about parenting? Let them kind of develop details. Let them bring these aspects to it. His wife might have different aspects of the story that he might agree with, but that she's presenting, and vice versa. So in going from the very simplistic thing that Clint might be saying is, well, my wife's being stubborn, you might say something like, Clint, you're a smart person, and I know that our experiences have a lot of layers to them. And it's very clear to me that you're proud of the work that you and your wife have done in raising your children. But I'm curious about something. Um, Even though the main part of you is happy with the accomplishment that your kids are successful and they're launched out of the house and they're doing well in college, is there any part of you that's sad about an era in your life being over? There are two different things to that question or that statement. It's the first is, start at the beginning with, you know, an affirmation, and you don't want to do it in an insincere, shallow way, but it's still the like, look, I know you understand this, and I'm embedding buy-in to what I'm about to say, because I'm saying, like, because you're a smart person, you're going to agree with what I'm about to say. Um, it's understanding and recognizing what is the narcissistic individual's natural defenses, and what are going to be the subtle things that we can do to bypass it. Again, the goal is not to be insincere, because in this situation, I might genuinely feel that Clint is a smart person. I might feel that he's empathetically impaired, but that doesn't change the fact that I may also see him as intelligent in other ways. So all I'm doing is just calling that out. I'm recognizing it in a way that diminishes natural resistance. And I'm doing that, and then I'm agreeing with something about his perspective. Because as you're letting them talk and you're hearing how they're developing their story and they're talking about what matters to them, Clint's perspective is, it's like, look, we did our job as parents. Our kids are not still at home. There's such and such's kid who's still living in the basement and he's 35. And aren't we lucky that our kids are doing okay? And as opposed to saying, well, you're missing the point, that, you should be sad about this. Um, you affirm and you recognize, that this is great. You have a great accomplishment as a parent, and you're proud of that. And you're also proud about what your wife's done in it. But is there a part of you that may be feeling something different? Because that there are different parts of you that could feel different things. And it opens up a little bit of the window, a little bit more, to where it was closed more. You're saying, yes, this thing you're saying is absolutely true, but can something else also be true, even if it's just true in a small way? And by doing that, that might open Clint up to say, well, yeah, of course I'm sad. Oh, okay. What are the things you think you might miss about this era and like being gone? Well, I loved going to my daughter's volleyball games. Like, she was a great player, and and I liked being in. Don't get to do that anymore. But and they'll be very quick to kind of to rubber band and to pull back to the simplistic story. It's like, but I'm happy about it. I'm like, yes, Clint. I totally believe you're happy about it. That's great. And I don't want to diminish any of the happiness. I just want to make sure, because all the different layers of you are important, not just the biggest layer, but the small layers are important too. And so I just want to make sure all of you gets voice in this. And does it feel a little bit like manipulation? Sure. Part of what therapy is it's altruistic, purposeful manipulation. People are asking to, in the process that we're doing, to kind of have their emotions, their perspectives kind of turned in a certain direction. I always want to be authentic in how I'm talking with individuals, whether they're narcissistic leaning or not. But knowing that they have an excessive need for admiration, um, I'm want to be affirming to them in ways that are consistent with my view of them, and also in ways that I feel foster deeper senses of self independent. Oftentimes I want to be very focused on affirming them in their personhood and not their performance. They're oftentimes very focused on wanting to be affirmed in their performance. And though I'll recognize things that they'll say about performance, I always want to try to reaffirm my affirmation too. But this is something about you on a deeper level, and this is what's important to me. And they'll oftentimes respond to that. You know, I believe that inherently, that as humans we want to be affirmed in more meaningful ways. And so I'll take this as something that is important, and that I'm assuming that part of them is longing for this and part of them needs this. In Amber's case, you're looking with her, and one of the things that's clear as you're talking to Amber is that she will not admit to anything that feels like failure. She is giving you a very simplistic narrative about her whole life, which is just about success, her accomplishment, and her popularity. Um, and part of what's brought her into therapy, though, is that she's had a setback, and she can't. There's part of her that can't even. That it's almost. It almost feels like this major disconnect from reality. The most that she can do is very passing lip service to being let go from her job, and it's very quickly followed by the devaluation of the company or her boss that did it. But you might be talking with Amber, and what you're looking for is there a way that we can start talking about failure as something, not as a complete negative. And so, in looking how to thicken her story, you want to listen. What is some aspect of nuance? What's this little crack of nuance that I can see that can give me some layers? And you talk to her, and okay, here's something that you hear. Like she tells you that she reads a lot and she's really into history, and you're talking about, oh, well, what are some things you've read that you really enjoyed? And she talks about, oh, she recently read a biography of Winston Churchill that she loved. Oh, and you see an opening there because you may have not read that book, but you know some stuff about Winston Churchill's life. And you talk about, like, hey, Winston Churchill was an interesting character because he had these major successes and failures, and one right after the other. Like he had this major role in the British government in the First World War, but then he had this major failure, and he ordered this naval invasion that was a huge failure, and he had to resign. And then he got a cabinet position though later again. But then he had some really unpopular positions as the Nazis were coming to power in Europe. And then he had to resign too. And then he was considered this outcast for years. But then, in this moment, he became this great leader of Great Britain during the Second World War, and stood up against Nazi Germany, and is this really admired person today. But he had a lot of failures along the way. And that might be the opening. Because you're not necessarily even talking about Amber's failures at first. You're talking about somebody else's. But you could say, well, is this an admirable person? Or this is a person whose accomplishments are worth admiring? And how did failure intertwine into their successes? And how might failure have even improved their successes? How about their failure was even necessary to leading them to success? This is not necessarily for the thickening process, adding these dimensions in for someone without a personality disorder can oftentimes happen much more quickly. You're adding more and more nuance that allows much more possibilities in what to do. For a person with a strong personality disorder leaning, this can happen very slowly because, as we talked about before, they're seeing things in the sort of caricature world. And so getting to nuance is hard, but you listen, you take openings as they come, and you see it as sort of, you've got a window that's just cracked. You stick a wedge in, and you're getting a little more air, a little more light, and it involves kind of going back time and time again. But what happens over time as the story gets thickened is that they have the ideal nature of a thick story is it gives them options. Going back to Clint and his situation, the issue was, it's a simplistic thing to say, like, well, my wife is stubborn or my wife just needs to get over it. A thicker story over time for his situation could be, hey, there's something that's been sad about this transition for both of you. For both you and your wife, there have been things that have been sad. Now, the sadness has affected each of you differently. And it may get into that Clint's desire to travel. You hear more of a story and you realize, like, oh, like when the couple was first together and before they had children, they used to travel a lot. And that was something Clint loved. But then when they had children, they couldn't do it as easily because of financial constraints or time constraints. And so they've traveled a lot less. But he's been looking forward to years being able to have freedom to travel again. And that might bring up doing some grief work for something that happened years ago. That there was something about transitioning from being a couple without children to being a couple with children that was kind of caused some grief for Clint that he didn't experience really. And so it's giving voice to that. And by giving voice to that, it allows him to maybe begin to have some of the empathetic experience to aspects of what his wife might be experiencing now. The thick story gives options. You experience things together. There are different things to, um, uh, okay, if this is sadness relating to a transition, then how do we continue to work through the transition as opposed to just saying get over it? There might be different possibilities of things that can be done. In the end, that's the goal of a thicker story. Um, see if you have any questions at this point. Um, as I'm also working to stay hydrated. Let's see if there's a few things that come up. One thought came up is in the idea of looking at thicker stories. Um, do you ever disagree with somebody if they're saying something that just feels blatantly untrue? Yes-ish. It's kind of. Again, it depends. Part of it is looking at it and talking about the narcissistic style. It's all about what do I believe they can hear, and this does bring up a point for narcissistic individuals I've been friends with and I've worked with therapeutically, and it's something that surprises other therapists. Is oftentimes I'm very direct with narcissistic leaning individuals. Like I'll be very blunt with them, and sometimes in ways that will come across as critical, um, because for a lot of narcissistic individuals, the way they want admiration and they want flattery, but they're also very suspicious of flattery because they don't want to. They want to feel that people are praising them, but people are also being honest, and they'll get very suspicious if they feel like, well, I don't feel, they want to feel like you're being sincere. And in their desire for sincerity, sometimes I'll say something very direct, but I still have to be careful of how cutting I'll be or how, but I can get away with it because if they take it as I'm being honest with them because I respect them, oftentimes that's something that matters more to them than just the blind admiration. It's a different sort of admiration. But as far as disagreeing with things, what they're saying is always true to a point, because it's always true in that it's the truth of their perspective, even if it doesn't hold up to anything outside of their perspective. And so I always want to validate it in the sense of like, yes, this is what you feel. But an example of when their experience comes against the perceived reality of family members or a spouse or even me, I'll begin to challenge it, and maybe even using that cognitive empathy. It's like, but can you understand why this other person doesn't see it this way? Detach it from emotions, but can you see, like, this is what the other person experienced? Does that make sense to you, at least why they see it this way? And at the very least, if I'm opening them up to the possibility of something else being true as well, then I sometimes can get away with not having to challenge them directly. Because the other thing that will happen with narcissists, it goes to the idealization devaluation thing. They will change their mind about what is true. And if they do it on their own, you don't have to do it for them. And it goes to the same way that they'll go to something that's all good to something being all bad. That represents a huge directional shift. And they did it on their own. And so sometimes if they can be steered in that direction without it being, if they think it's their idea, then they're much more likely to be less resistant to taking it, to having that, to them kind of flowing with that. But good thought, good question. And yeah, sometimes you do have to go against their perception of reality, but in the more you can do it in a subtle way that feels like something that they are owning themselves, as opposed to an idea that's being imposed upon them, the more traction you'll get with it. Next technique is externalization. This technique, along with the next one, unique outcomes, is this isn't something exclusive to narrative therapy. There are other postmodern approaches to therapy that will use externalization as a technique, specifically solution focus, which is another therapeutic approach that I'm a huge fan of. Some people will resist externalization because it just feels like semantics. But as a narrative therapist, I believe semantics matter. I believe how we talk about something is very, very important. I believe how the client talks about it and how I talk about it is very important. In the idea of externalization, it's depersonalizing a pathology or a problem, and taking the situation with Clint. He at the beginning is talking about the problem is in the way he's talking about his wife. It's about what she's doing or not doing, but she is the problem. It makes therapy, particularly in dealing with multiple people, an adversarial process, and it's unhelpful in that way. For Amber, her level of denial and avoidance is very much related to, if she were to admit what is going on, then it invalidates her in some way. She becomes the problem. And so since her ego is so fragile, she can't tolerate to be the problem. She has to deny it or divert it. Externalization is a way of talking about the problem in a way that takes it outside of the person. And it can make the whole thing much more approachable. Oftentimes it will involve talking about the problems of giving it a name. If a client's talking about a particularly anxious feeling that they're having, and say in Amber's situation, you get into, as you get into the details of her story, as she gives you more detail and you're able to dig out more and more nuance, you come to find out that she graduated, and even though she doesn't admit it very openly, that there was a part of her that was very nervous going to work for this place because, there was aspects of it that were intimidating. And a lot of what led her to have the problems at work were responses to her wanting to do well in the job. And As a narrative therapist, you can talk about this in a way that gives them a way to give it a name, to be something outside of themselves. And so, like in Amber's situation, you might say something like, well, if we could talk about some of the stuff you were experiencing or you were feeling when you were first starting the job, let's give it a name. Let's call it pressure. And then you began talking about pressure like a person. You can say, so what were the ways that pressure was really making it difficult for you in this job? How was it affecting you? So all of a sudden you start talking about an experience that they've identified internally as something outside of themselves. By doing that, for somebody particularly with a very fragile ego, they can start talking about it in ways that are more realistic, that doesn't feel as internally threatening to themselves. They are not their dysfunction. Their dysfunction is something outside of themselves. For Amber's case, when you talk about the problem being pressure, and pressure is something that's outside of her, that's something that she experiences, but it's not her, then she can start talking bad about it. She can start she can start saying like, I hate pressure. And you can start getting more information about it. How did this come up in different places in your life? When you were in undergrad, how did pressure come up in your life, and how did it affect you then? And how did you respond to it then? And what were the things that were helpful about how you responded? What are the way the pressure affected you that really kind of you really came out worse for? It makes them less defensive in that way. And even just how we use language is interesting. Like, for in English, there's a way that we phrase things that if you do a direct translation in other languages, doesn't make sense. When we talk about our negative experiences of emotions, we'll talk about I'm depressed or I'm anxious. But if you were to do like a fairly literal translation in other languages to that wouldn't make sense. I'm not fluent to any degree in any other language, but I did fumble through some high school Spanish. And I do know that in the what we oftentimes translate to I am in Spanish, soy, wouldn't describe depression in that way. You wouldn't use soy to talk about your depression, because it wouldn't make sense. It would be like saying I am the personification of depression. I am the manifestation of depression. How we would say it in other languages is I experience depression. Other languages have much more natural externalizations than we do in English. But even just how we say like I'm depressed, our phrasing even, it saddles us very tightly with something in a way that's less helpful. In Clint's situation, externalization has another benefit. Clint's not necessarily seeing the problem as internal to himself, but he's seeing the problem as internal to his wife. And that makes it adversarial between them. But one of the ways you can start talking about for Clint in his situation, the personification may be talking about grief. And then you can start asking about, Clint, from your perspective, how do you see grief in this time as affecting your wife? So all of a sudden, even when that question sets up the framework of that, the wife is not the problem, grief is the problem. And it's something that this other person is experiencing. And so then it makes it less adversarial. And then you can go and ask the question, well, let's talk about the ways that grief has affected you right now. How's grief affected you in the past? How's grief affecting you now? And then in a family approach, it allows them to be on the same team together, as opposed to an adversarial sort of thing. Grief has affected both of you. It's affected you differently, maybe, but it's still affected both of you. And how do we kind of team up together and fight grief together, or fight this pressure together? Let's get on, I'm on your team. I'm on your side. Your parents are on your side. Your wife's on your side. Your husband's on your side. And for somebody who can't take on a lot of nuance, setting this language up differently, again, opens up some options there. Any questions so far? Okay. Unique outcomes. again, this is similar to a process with a lot of the other postmodern therapies. Um, Simple question asked this to Amber. Can you remember a time when pressure didn't have as strong of a voice in your life? Um, what's an example when pressure was at its weakest? Um, Amber may be more open to talk about it in this way because it's not, again, you've already externalized that she's not the problem, but then it can allow her to start looking for, like, well, when did I do better? And she relates to past situations um, where, let's say that she's on, I'm trying to think of examples I had. Let's say Amber comes up with a situation. It may take you a while to get to this example. And some of it is when you're listening to their stories, finding unique outcomes for personality disorders can, again, like the thickening process, can take a long time. Because in the narcissistic style, they're telling lots of black and white stories. They're telling a lot of stories about themselves with heroes and villains and all good and all bad. And to finding those exceptions oftentimes involves finding nuance. But after a while, you hear the story from Amber that you really focus on. Okay, this is grist for the mill. I can use this. Amber tells you a story about her friend Katie, that they were really, really close friends, but they had a falling out because there was this boy that Amber was really interested in, but she didn't tell anyone about. But the boy ended up asking Katie out, and Katie didn't know that Amber had an interest, but that uh, uh, Amber felt very wounded by Katie in that, and so it very quickly became this devaluation. Katie went from being my best friend to she's worthless, telling all these nasty stories about her, and Katie had no clue what had happened. She just caught off guard. But years later, there's a situation where they reconnect, and Amber's gotten over that boy and gotten over the situation, and now she's close with Katie again. When you're dealing with narcissistic individuals, oftentimes you'll hear stories like that. They'll have major falling outs with individuals, but sometimes they come back around. Now, it's not always because the narcissist, you know, claim that, oh, I was wrong, but they were willing to. There was some other thing that kind of made amends in the situation. But that might be the exception to the rule that Amber's able to hear. And you might just reflect that, you're like, there was this time that you had this disconnect from Katie, but you got over it, and you were able, what about that situation allowed you to kind of get past the problem? For Clint, his story might be that um, he thinks about back when uh, before he and his wife had children, and he realizes, we didn't quit traveling just because we didn't have children. We quit traveling because there was more work that I had to do, and I had more responsibilities, and we just didn't have the time anymore. And he's able through an ongoing process to say, like, yeah, I was kind of unhappy with that. And you're like, well, how did you get over it? And it may take them a while to kind of come up with a unique outcome, but the unique outcomes always have the solutions in them. There's somewhere, somehow, that clients experience success where they're not in this moment. It may even be in just a small sort of way. But if you're able to find that oftentimes gives you the first bricks, the first building blocks to go forward in allowing something to be different. If you're able to find a point where a particular problem that they're seeing was weak, or even better, not present, and you can let the client explore all the nuances of that. What were the reasons? What were the strategies that you used? What were things that you don't have in your life right now that would be more helpful for you to have? Sometimes it's small things. Sometimes clients would be like, well, I was in a better mood when I was exercising regularly. I haven't been exercising. Then it's like, okay, that might not be the whole thing. Um, uh, Related to the thickening process and looking at unique outcomes, I'm very quick to kind of talk about, as we're trying to come up with new solutions, to set modest expectations for them. Modest expectations is not something narcissists naturally have. They naturally are constantly pushing for this is going to be the best or the biggest. I'll often say before we try something, say like, I don't expect this to be the whole thing because very few things that any of us try is going to be the answer to everything. But maybe this could be a small piece. And if we can find some small piece that will improve this in some way, then and we're just kind of notching it away just a little bit by little bit, we can often get there. We can often get forward. Any questions? Any um it's a very honest question. The question is that one of the issues with narcissists is they often invoke very strong and negative emotions in us. Um, why work with them? Why put ourselves through the hardship? Um, that is a very good and honest question. And I would say, on some level, it's why work with anybody. Ultimately, we're in this profession because we, at least on some level, we have a desire to help people. Um, even the story of how I did this workshop, part of this workshop was, when I started as a counselor, I did not have this idea of like, I really want to work a lot with narcissists. Um, they've just sort of found me, and I'm very curious of what that says about me, that a lot of narcissistic individuals like working with me. Um, some of it I do claim is that not purposefully, but I just collected a lot of credentials over the years, and so when um, my name's out there professionally, I have a lot of letters behind it. And I've had like several narcissistic individuals that comment on that. That comment like, "Well, I chose you because you are because you're an LMFT and an LPC. Therefore, there's no sense in me explaining to them that I have dual licenses, but they involve going through fairly similar coursework and supervision, and that I didn't like earn them all completely separately. And it's they choose me. But I think some of what helps me work with narcissists is early in my counseling career, I worked a lot with teenagers. I still work with teenagers a decent amount, but I worked a lot with teenagers early on. And something that dawned on me one day is that the difference between the typical narcissistic adult male I was working with, the difference between them and 15-year-old boys was typically budget. The narcissistic men I worked with had bigger budgets, and that was about it. They were kind of these overgrown adolescents. And that actually helped me in the empathetic process with them, is that they were stuck. They were kind of in this arrested development place. And they were so exasperating to so many people that I wanted to help them move past the point. Part of it was because I felt for them. The other bit was I also felt for a lot of the people like in their families. Oftentimes, again, narcissism was presented to me because I was working with their children or I was working with their spouse. And so some of it also came from a strong sense of empathy with the other person. Like, you're living with them all the time. I want to help you in this. But one of the biggest things I tell students and supervisees, even myself sometimes, that when dealing with any personality disorder, and that makes it really hard, is when you ask the question, you're dealing with a narcissistic individual, who suffers the most for this person being a narcissist? And the answer is them. You know, different people may suffer to different degrees based on their level of proximity to them. The wife of the narcissist may suffer more than their coworker because the wife has to live with them at a deeper level. But nobody has to live with a narcissist as much as the narcissist themselves. They're constantly in their own head, and they're constantly responding, in their grandiose ways because of deep insecurities, of deep feelings of vulnerability and uncertainty. And if we think to ourselves, oftentimes we feel like we can, if if they would just be honest with those feelings of vulnerability, it'd be easier for us to work with. But part of their defense mechanism structure is that they aren't, or they can't be, even to themselves. And so being patient enough to work with them through it, um, I don't know, it's being the person that's willing to step with them in it. And that being said, not all of us can do everything. Some of y'all might be taking this workshop to learn how to better avoid having them in your counseling practice, and that's okay. I do not do very well with borderline individuals, particularly females. And part of that in my own story was I dated a few of them in my past. And so my level of countertransference with borderlines is pretty high. It's not as bad as it used to be, but I'm not a very good fit for them. And so I like being able to identify borderline so I can make quick referrals to think of like, okay, I'm not going to be very balanced with you. And we cannot be the perfect counselor for everybody. And sometimes you might do really well with certain narcissistic individuals, but you have to manage how many of them you have in your caseload. Because it's like working with trauma clients or working with any sort of highly suicidal clients, that there's not all of our clients take the same level of emotional energy. And part of our own self-care and managing emotional fatigue is figuring out that balance. And we'll actually talk more about that later. But good question. Thank you for it. Next technique is therapeutic audiencing. This is something that happens after the other techniques we've talked about, after doing a thickening process, or it's something you can do while still thickening, but it's a part of it and comes midway and towards the end of it. The assumption is that any client is coming in telling a very thin narrative. They're telling a story that involves a lot of overly simplistic paradigms that keep them from engaging well in what they're trying to do. And you, in the thickening process, are trying to take the details that they're presenting to allow more and more levels, more and more layers to what they are experiencing, to what they're doing. The audiencing process involves encouraging space and times where the client is retelling the new story. So some of it is after you've done a certain amount of time out, you'd sit with Clint and say, so tell me how you're seeing the situation right now. Like when you first came in, this is what you said. Like this is how you expressed your perception of the situation. But as we've talked, I've seen you like have a lot more layers of understanding of things. So how would you explain it now? It's encouraging them to talk about it in their own words. And you kind of become the choir for them in that. You encourage space for them to tell it, and that you're giving them a lot of amens and hallelujahs as they're telling the story, which kind of helps reinforce the story as it's being told. Clint may be talking about, yeah, when we first started talking, I thought very much about like, we'll say Clint's wife's name is Anne. This was very much Anne's problem. But I realized like this has been hard for her because it's hard on me too. And he might still tell it in a very self-focused way still, but it has more layers. And you're like, yeah, that really is it. This is, yeah, you said this the other week. And sometimes it's filing information of stuff they say to repeat back to them. And, but if then they can say it, they can be their own words, it can be their own telling. Then it becomes their level of ownership in it is much greater. This is true for all clients, but it's specifically true for the personality disordered styles. Since they have such a hard time taking feedback, if the feedback can be their own, it's kind of like for those who have seen the movie Inception. It's how do you take an idea and you plant it in a way that they feel it's their own idea. And therapeutic audiencing allows that to be expressed and explored. But it's deliberately setting aside time in the session to say, tell me how you see it. And sometimes there's a false start. Sometimes when you're giving space for therapeutic audiencing, they'll still talk about the problem in an overly simplistic way. And then you go back to thickening. You go back to bringing in different things, and you try audiencing in another time in another way. But ideally, eventually they'll get to a point they'll be able to tell the improved, more nuanced, thicker narrative in their own words. And there's something just very powerful in it happening that way that makes it much more applicable to clients as it comes up. Those are the big techniques. I want to take this last section as we're going to our home stretch for considerations for yourself of, in the home stretch, how do you think about things as a therapist? Now, the first is the stuff we've already touched on. Being very aware of what sort of transference and countertransference is going on. Transference being, the projections or the things that the client is putting on us. The countertransference is the stuff we're putting on them. Like I shared a moment ago, I am not a blank slate. And that's one of the, I think, a big thing for all of us to recognize in our therapeutic process. We are not blank slates. We bring our own history, our own experiences. In this particular topic, we've had our own experiences with narcissists in our personal life, in our therapeutic life, that shape how we conceptualize every new client we see and what sort of emotions come up for us. In our own countertransference, there are certain things that are unavoidable. The best thing we can do is have as good of awareness as we can, and try to, in that awareness, be proactive in how we manage it as it comes up. Like I said, all of us will get triggered, and I've had just people with personality disorders or personality disorder styles wound me in my life. And so there's certain things that clients will say or do that will just take me back there. And I've just got to take that moment. And that's where just, good, self-care comes in. And okay, how am I being triggered? What's going on? And in the transference aspect, how does this client see me? And it may be different in different times in the therapy process. But what am I representing to them? And what might be going on in this? Very quickly I find I represent an ally to them, and I'm in a very tentative orbit, where the beginning of therapy, I'm in the idealization phase. Everything I'm doing is great because they see me as an ally that's going to help them get something that they want, or to accomplish something. And being aware of that transference helps me because if I know that I'm in a very tentative position, I walk appropriately. It's not necessarily, I was going to say walk carefully, but to me that implies a certain amount of walking on eggshells. And that's not necessarily what you want to do. It is, though, knowing that, okay, here's a bit of feedback I probably need to give them. And this may knock me out of orbit. I need to be prepared that when I say this, the switch is going to flip, and I'm going to move into that devaluation place. And I got to be prepared for that. And what's helpful is when you are prepared for that, you stand up to it in sometimes more effective ways. My own issues that can come up with, feeling dependent and wanting my clients to like me is if I get hit, if I give them a bit of feedback that may be very appropriate and very needed, and that hits the switch from idealization to devaluation, and I get a lot of devaluation from them, my natural personality style may lead me to want to make up to them and maybe back down and try, how do I get back in their good graces? But if I know that this is something that's going to be inevitable and it comes up, then I'm less reactive to it. So just a good awareness in there to happen. Be aware with how you're getting sucked into how they're telling their story. Like, one of the ways that I know that I'm getting sucked in is if I am too caught up into the presentation of the caricatures that they are presenting to me. I am feeling a whole lot of the um, as they're telling the story about their parents or their coworkers, that I'm seeing everything in their lens as this is it. This is exactly what it is. And it's, one of the things I talk about with colleagues is, it's not that you necessarily believe, that you discount everything that they say. If you've already kind of gotten a feel that this is a narcissistic individual, it's not that everything that they say is untrue. It's why I like to use the word caricature. If you've ever been to an amusement park and you sat down and you got a drawing caricature done of yourself, part of that style is certain physical features are accentuated, that they're made to be disproportionate to what things actually are. And that's what it is in a personality disordered storytelling. It's not that none of the things they're identifying are completely untrue, but they're given uh, they're featured disproportionately. And so as I'm listening to them, I want to be thinking to myself, am I seeing the people that are populating their world that they're telling me about? Am I seeing them as nuanced individuals the same way I'm trying to see this client? Or am I seeing a whole bunch of, wolves and sheep? Am I seeing a whole bunch of heroes and villains? And if I am finding myself in that moment, I'll even, sometimes it'll be part of the therapeutic process. It'd be like, you're talking about your ex-husband in this way. What are things that were good about him? Nothing. He was, and again, that thickening process may not be easy, but even if it's not a conversation with a client, what are things with myself that I'm thinking of? How am I giving some people maybe the benefit of the doubt? How am I trying to be open to the layers that may not be obviously presented by the client in this situation, in order to be more effective or helpful in what's going on? So, questions. um, Length of treatment. If you're working with somebody that is fairly personality disordered, treatment is not necessarily short, in the sense of like accomplishing things. Now, sometimes it might be short because if you go out of their orbit in a certain way, they may discontinue. Um, but you have to be prepared that these people are going to necessarily, that if they stick with therapy, if you get good alliance, and it can happen. And it's a really, like, I find a lot of these individuals, when you get in a good rhythm with them, they can be a lot of fun. For one, they're hard, and in a certain way, hard clients can be fun clients. You feel like you're like, I'm really getting into some stuff here. Um, but when you have somebody whose experience of the world has been um, a disproportionate amount of unsafe vulnerability, and even if it's just little glimpses at a time, they're able to start seeing you as a safe place, as somebody that's willing to affirm them in a way that's not conditional or superficial in the way that they've felt their affirmation in the past. Um, and they start seeing you as a safe person. Again, it can take a very long time to do, but they can have very deep buy-in and can work for a very long time. Some of the people I've worked the longest with in counseling, people I've seen for years, are people with pretty strong personality disorder stylings. But if you love short-term therapy, and having a good awareness of personality disorders is probably good, because it will help you, limit them as in your intakes, because it ends up taking a long time. And it's just something to consider as you're looking at this. Also, in that, looking at how many of these individuals can you work with in at a given point. Part of caring for people well is recognizing that we have certain limits. I have limits as a therapist in certain sorts of cases. High suicidality, post-affair, and trauma, very like intense trauma, I have limits to. Like I can, if I'm seeing too many of these sorts of individuals in my caseload, um, it can be fatiguing in a way that's unfair to other clients. And so I will reach points where I may be taking new clients, but I'm not taking any more post-affair. I'm not, and different, and it's not the same for all of us. To be honest, narcissists are wearing on me if I'm doing couples work. But if I'm doing individual counseling with them, they don't drain me quite in the same way. partly because if I have a decent awareness of them, I'm not getting sucked into their whirlpool, and if I'm not working with someone else in the room that's constantly dealing with the pain that this individual is inflicting on them, it's just less exhausting to me, and so I can usually get into a rhythm with them and be okay. But if it's in a couple setting, I have to be aware of it. And so just if you're seeing a lot of these individuals, just be aware of how many are you seeing. Boundaries. We've talked about different sort of boundaries, but some practical ways that this comes up. We'll take the case of Amber. You really like Amber. She's very charismatic. She's very charming. You feel she has a skewed view of her world, but you get caught up with her. And one of the things you notice about when you do a session with Amber is she shows up late often, or she oftentimes pushes to run over. She's one of those clients you might be great in ending on time with all your other clients. But for her, she's really bad in the last 5 minutes. She brings up something really heavy that you feel like I have to attend this. Or even when you're starting to say, hey, we need to wrap up, and you stand up and you go to the door, they don't move. There's one individual that comes to mind that I've worked with for years, and he's the only person I set a timer for. Usually I have a clock that sits behind my clients, and I'm usually just pretty good at watching it. But for this client, I have to get out my phone and set a timer, and it has to go off because he has to hear it too. It's not for me, like he has to hear it. And then I immediately have to get up, go to the door, and even still, this client has a hard time kind of ending. They will test the boundary because part of it goes to the whole diagnostic feature of they're special and they feel that they should have special treatment. And so I'm more important than whoever else might be waiting. And you might give them more time because let's say you have an empty slot after them. And so you're like, well, no one's really waiting and this seems important. They're doing really good work and they're opening up, or all these reasons that we make to kind of push boundaries with clients. Like but narcissists will push it more. And it's all the more important to be able to show affirmation and consistent regard for them in the context of good boundaries. You have to have, as a therapist, you have to be at a place of a certain level of comfort with conflict. And I say that with a grain of salt. I do not enjoy conflict. It's a hallmark of a lot of things in my life, a lot of my relationships. I force myself to do conflict because I believe that's a requirement for healthy relationships sometimes. But as far as my natural temperament, I never want to pick a fight. I never just how can everyone get along? And that's my MO. It's not just a question of are you okay if your clients don't like you? It's how okay are you with your clients not liking you, and how okay are you with them sometimes very strongly expressing how much you've disappointed them. And when you fall out of a narcissistic orbit, that will happen. Sometimes they'll do it directly, sometimes they'll do it very subtly. I think of one situation I was in years ago where I had somebody who he would late cancel his appointments frequently, and I would charge him for missing appointments. And but he didn't feel he needed to be charged because he was special. And so he would disappear from counseling for certain stretches of time. In his mind, I think, is a way to punish me for holding to a boundary. And I'll be honest, my initial emotional gut reaction in it was oftentimes like, how do I got to make this okay. I got to but I had to be okay with him not liking me. And I had to determine, and this is probably good for any therapeutic relationship, I have to put the priority of what is the good for the client over what I want. And if I can do that, it puts us in a better place. Some of you all may do therapeutic contracts as a part of your treatment process. I've known different people that do different things, and they treat this differently. Even if you don't have this as a regular part of your practice, um, in identifying working with these individuals, this can be helpful. And what I mean by a contract is it's kind of an informed consent process. It doesn't always have to be like written down on paper, though that can be helpful. It's when you're working with somebody, hey, like this is how I approach therapy. These are things that might come up. Um, if you want to quit there, but you're agreeing here that if you're gonna quit therapy, that we're gonna at least do it in this way. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you can enforce it. But a lot of these clients may prematurely terminate because of any number of things that come up. And if you can have things in place that help prevent that, um, oftentimes it will get over, their defenses are oftentimes, something that happens as a knee-jerk reaction. And if you can help them get past the knee-jerk and being kind of okay with the discomfort, um, then, if they can play through the pain, I guess, a little bit, oftentimes they'll re-engage. And so having a good informed consent and contract in place of how you do therapy can sometimes be a big factor in helping them get over that when it happens. And I think that's important to talk about too, is that the devaluation, if you work with a narcissist for any amount of time, the devaluation process is not going to be a question of if, it's going to be a question of when. And if you accept that it's a question of when, then you can plan for it at the beginning. Not that you can always plan perfectly or you can control the situation when it happens. But if you accept at least that it will happen, then I don't know, it will catch you wrong-footed less often. Um, Looking at external supports is also very important. And I mean this both for the therapist and for the client. Um, these can be very exhausting clients. And so if you're working with them, what are the things that help manage your own self-care? Do you have consultation? Do you have your own supervision that you're doing? Do you have even your own therapy that you're doing? But also for the clients themselves, they part of how they manifest in their personality disordered style can lead to a lot of natural isolation. And if you have certain elements that both sustain them and help keep them accountable in the therapeutic process, it can be very difficult in doing group therapy with people with personality disorders. One of my professors in graduate school highlighted that to me. He goes, nothing will mess up a group dynamic quickly than a personality disorder. And then I remember seeing it happen for the first time. I was leading groups in an inpatient psychiatric hospital, and there was a pretty severe personality disordered individual in the group. And literally, people just kept on walking out of the room. Now, I was also a student intern and didn't know what I was doing. And I didn't know how to manage what this person was bringing up, and it was just really disruptive. Um, Personality disordered individuals can work in groups. They just require more attention and maintenance in that way. But the benefit of group for these individuals is if they're willing to have a certain amount of vulnerability with other people besides just you as the therapist, that can help reinforce the external supports. We're wrapping up now. Thank you.